The old Volvo's headlights cut through the oppressive darkness of the forest. Emily gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. The forest pressed in on the narrow road. Twisted branches, like skeletal fingers, scraped against the car. She was late, later than she intended. The lawyer's warning echoed in her head, "Don't go there at night." But here she was, on her way to Blackwood Manor. The old house had been in her family for generations, but no one had lived there for almost a century. Not since her great-great-aunt Margaret had mysteriously disappeared. Emily had only seen pictures, faded sepia images in a dusty album. They hinted at the grandeur that Blackwood Manor once held. Now it was just a spooky old house she had inherited. A shiver ran down her spine, and it wasn't just from the cool night air seeping through the car's old heater. There was a weight in the air, a palpable sense of dread that seemed to grow stronger the closer she got. The forest seemed to close in around her, the darkness becoming a living, breathing entity. Emily chided herself for being silly. It was just an old house, a little creepy maybe, but nothing to be scared of. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into something dangerous. The forest finally gave way, and the manor loomed before her, a gothic silhouette against the moonless sky. Relief, swift and unexpected, washed over her. She wasn't sure she could have taken another minute in those woods. As she drove up the long, winding driveway, the headlights illuminated the dilapidated facade of Blackwood Manor. The once grand mansion was now a decaying relic of its former glory. The stone walls were crumbling, consumed by ivy that clung to the building like grasping claws. Windows were boarded up or shattered like vacant eyes staring out into the night. Gargoyles, their features eroded by time and weather, leered down from the rooftops. Even in its state of disrepair, Blackwood Manor held a certain majesty. The moonlight glinted off the few remaining intact windows, giving the impression of a malevolent intelligence watching her approach. Emily parked the car, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. For a moment she hesitated. She could turn around, go back to the city, forget any of this ever happened. But some unseen force seemed to hold her there. She had come too far to turn back now. The interior of Blackwood Manor was shrouded in an eerie silence, thick with the smell of dust and decay. Moonlight spilled through the grimy windows, illuminating the vast, empty rooms. Cobwebs hung from every corner, and the air was heavy with the weight of neglect and forgotten memories. Emily wandered through the darkened rooms, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. Each room seemed to whisper tales of its former occupants, their laughter and sorrow lingering like ghosts in the air. She found herself drawn to a narrow, uncarpeted staircase that descended into the darkness. The air grew noticeably colder as she made her way down, the smell of damp earth replacing the musty odor of decay. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a cramped, dirt-floored basement. The only source of light came from a single, cobweb-covered window at the far end of the room. There, in the far wall, was a door. It was made of thick oak, heavily reinforced and secured with a rusted padlock. Emily's heart quickened. What could be behind this door, hidden away in the depths of the manor? She felt an inexplicable pull towards it, an overwhelming urge to unlock its secrets. The old padlock, eaten away by rust and time, yielded with a groan. The heavy oak door creaked open, revealing a small, dusty room beyond. It was clear that this room had been sealed for decades, perhaps even a century. The air was thick with the smell of decay and something else, something ancient and vaguely unsettling. Emily stepped inside, her hand trembling as she reached for the light switch. The room was sparsely furnished, with only a heavy wooden table in the center and several shelves lining the walls. The shelves were stacked with ancient books, bound in leather and secured with rusted chains. The sight sent a shiver down Emily's spine. She reached out, her fingers tracing the embossed symbols on the covers. They were unlike anything she had ever seen before, strange and disturbing. But it was the object on the table that truly captivated her attention. It was a mirror, tall and narrow, with an ornate silver frame. The silver was tarnished and blackened with age, and the glass was cracked, spiderwebbing out from the center. It was as if the mirror itself was wounded, its reflection fractured and distorted. Emily found herself drawn towards it, compelled by some unseen force. As Emily stepped closer to the mirror, a cold shiver ran down her spine. The air grew heavy, charged with a strange energy that made it difficult to breathe. She raised her hand, her fingers hovering just inches from the cracked surface of the glass. Her reflection stared back at her, a distorted, grotesque mockery of her own features. But something was wrong. Her reflection moved. It smiled, a slow, cruel stretching of its lips that revealed rows of sharp, pointed teeth. Emily stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. Before she could scream, her reflection began to ripple like water disturbed by a stone. The fractured pieces of her image swirled together, coalescing into a dark, shadowy figure. The figure stepped out of the mirror, crossing the threshold from reflection to reality with an ease that sent a jolt of terror through Emily's veins. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but formed of shadows and darkness. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, two pinpricks of malevolent intelligence that seemed to bore into her very soul. Emily tried to scream, but terror choked the sound in her throat. She was paralyzed, frozen in place by the sheer horror of what she was witnessing. "Emily," the figure hissed, its voice a raspy whisper that seemed to slither around the room. Emily wanted to run, to tear her gaze away from the horrifying apparition before her, but she couldn't. It was as if she was rooted to the spot, her feet encased in concrete. The figure took a step closer, its shadowy form rippling and shifting with each movement. Emily could feel the coldness radiating from it, a bone-chilling aura that seemed to drain the warmth from the air around her. "You should not be here," the figure whispered, its voice a low growl that seemed to vibrate in Emily's chest. "This place is mine." Emily tried to speak, to demand what it was and what it wanted, but no sound came out. The figure lunged, its shadowy hand shooting out to wrap around Emily's throat. Emily's vision swam as she clawed at the icy grip, but the figure was impossibly strong. She was suffocating, her lungs burning for air. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the wicked grin on the figure's face, a grotesque parody of delight. Emily gasped, her eyes flying open. She was lying on the cold, damp floor of the hidden room, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. The room was empty. The only sounds were the pounding of her own heart and the wind whistling through the cracks in the manor walls. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of the shadowy figure. But it was gone. The only evidence of its presence was the lingering chill in the air and the terror that clawed at the edges of Emily's mind. She stumbled out of the room, back through the basement and up the creaking stairs. She didn't stop running until she was outside, the cool night air stinging her lungs and the moon casting long, eerie shadows around her. As she fumbled with her car keys, her gaze fell on the shattered window of the hidden room, the only visible sign of the horror that lay within. Emily didn't waste any time. She threw the car into gear and sped away from Blackwood Manor. The terrifying image of the shadowy figure burned into her mind. She had escaped with her life, but she knew deep down that she wasn't truly free. Something had followed her from that house, something dark and hungry. Section 8. The Haunting Begins. The days that followed were a blur of fear and paranoia. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that something was constantly lurking just beyond the edge of her vision. The shadows in her apartment seemed to deepen and twist, taking on sinister shapes that sent shivers down her spine. She would wake in the dead of night, her heart pounding in her chest, convinced that she could hear the rasping whisper of the figure's voice, calling her name. The events at Blackwood Manor had shaken her to her core, leaving her feeling vulnerable and afraid in a way she had never experienced before. She tried to tell herself that it was all in her head, that the trauma of that night had manifested itself in these hallucinations. But deep down she knew the truth. Something had followed her home from that house, something evil. Section 9. Searching for answers. Desperate for answers, Emily threw herself into researching the history of Blackwood Manor and its previous occupants. She spent countless hours in libraries and historical archives, poring over old documents and faded photographs, hoping to find some clue as to the nature of the entity that haunted her. She learned of the manor's dark reputation, the whispers of strange occurrences and unexplained disappearances that had plagued the house for centuries. She discovered records of her great-great-aunt Margaret's disappearance, her fate shrouded in mystery. The more Emily learned, the more convinced she became that whatever she had encountered in that hidden room was not a figment of her imagination. It was something ancient and powerful, something tethered to Blackwood Manor, and now to her. She tried to tell her friends and family about what had happened, about the shadowy figure and the haunting whispers that plagued her every waking moment, but they dismissed her stories as stress or post-traumatic stress. No one believed her. She was alone in her terror, haunted by a force she didn't understand and couldn't escape. Section 10. The Dark Truth. After weeks of relentless research, Emily finally stumbled upon a piece of information that made her blood run cold. Buried deep within the pages of a crumbling, leather-bound journal, she found an account of the mirror and the entity it housed. The journal belonged to a distant relative, a man obsessed with the occult who had lived in Blackwood Manor centuries ago. He wrote of the mirror as a conduit, a portal to a dark dimension where unspeakable horrors resided. He described the entity as a malevolent spirit, a being of pure shadow and malice that fed on fear and despair. According to his account, the mirror had been used in a ritual gone wrong, a desperate attempt to harness the entity's power that had resulted in tragedy and unleashed a curse upon the manor and its inhabitants. The entity, he wrote, was trapped within the mirror but could influence the world through its reflection, preying on those unfortunate enough to cross its path. Emily's blood ran cold as she realized the truth. The entity had chosen her, marked her as its own. Section 11. No escape. Emily was trapped, bound to the entity by an invisible tether of fear and despair. She knew that she could run, but she could never truly escape. The entity would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment when her guard was down, when her fear was at its highest. She thought about trying to destroy the mirror, to sever the connection between the entity and the mortal world. But deep down, she knew it was a futile hope. The entity was ancient and powerful, its hold on this world too strong to be broken by such simple means. Emily was left with a single terrifying truth. She was living on borrowed time. She had become a prisoner in her own life, haunted by an entity she couldn't defeat and couldn't escape. She was trapped in a nightmare, forever tethered to the darkness that resided within Blackwood Manor. The entity was waiting, and it would claim her eventually. It was only a matter of time.